Hey guys, and welcome to this edition of Scruff's Garage. So in today's video, we're talking new air intake systems for your Jeep Wrangler or Jeep Gladiator. Now often the question gets asked, is a new intake worth the money? Now part of that comes from what I would say are unrealistic expectations. Sometimes you see manufacturers claim some outlandish horsepower gains, 20 horsepower and 5 miles per gallon and some things, and then of course whether or not something is worth it or not is relative to what did you expect to get from it. So I thought for the context of this video, it'd be good to start and level set some expectations. So in terms of additional horsepower, well, let's think through it for just a second. In what way would replacing the air intake allow your engine to make more horsepower? So two fundamental ways. One is if the new air filter and intake tube can flow more air at less of a restriction. Now obviously you say, well, this is a giant air filter. Obviously it has to be able to flow more air than whatever your factory panel filter is. And that's true. However, you're still going to be limited. A given displacement engine turning at a whatever maximum RPM, 6,500 RPMs or so, can only use but so much airflow. And that even if you made this air filter the size of a garbage can, the engine just doesn't need but so much airflow. And so in terms of modern vehicle engineering and manufacturing, Jeep or any other brand is not leaving any horsepower typically on the table through an overly restrictive intake system. And even if there are some horsepower gains to be had, typically it would be wherever the maximum airflow demands are, which are typically the higher RPMs. So even if this gives you an additional 5 horsepower at 6,000 RPMs, how often do you really get to take advantage of that? On a normal street-driven vehicle like my Jeep, I hardly ever see 6,000 RPMs. So even if it does gain horsepower at those levels, you're probably not going to get too much from it. The other general way that one of these intakes could develop additional horsepower is if it is able to draw in cooler air. Cooler air makes more power, it's denser and less pre-detonation, the engine won't pull back, timing is bad, all those sorts of things. Now sometimes these get called cold air intakes. That's typically not very accurate. Unless it's drawing air from outside of the engine bay, I don't like calling these a cold air intake because it's still drawing the same air from under the hood. This air box will replace and sit in the same location as the factory air box that I'm taking out. So it's not drawing in general, any cooler air than what the factory air box could have. Now there are some design features that we'll talk about a little later that I think this airbox can help take advantage of some factory designs, and I'll show you that on the Jeep as we get the old intake out, is why I specifically selected this airbox. But in general, you're also going to be limited to whatever the ambient air temperature is. So if it's 80 degrees outside and your intake air temperature sensor is reading 82 degrees, well, you know, there's only a 2-degree difference there. There's not a lot of potential for cooler air. The best you could get would be 80-degree air, and that's just what the engine can make. So coming into this expecting that one of these intakes, whether it's your Jeep application or anything else that's a more modern vehicle, it's just simply probably not going to give you a ton of horsepower. So with that said, does that mean that replacing your intake is a complete waste of money? Well, not necessarily. Again, what do you expect to get from it? So one of the design considerations with the factory air box is they are intentionally designed to be quiet. They don't want any interior resonance coming from the intake system. Again, OEM manufacturers are trying to appeal to a broader audience, and loud exhaust or loud intakes typically appeal to a smaller subset of the market. So one of the benefits, if you're into it, that you get from an aftermarket intake is they are typically louder. You hear a deeper sucking noise when you step on the throttle. So if that is something you want, then that would be a benefit to these. And I say that because not everything that we do as automotive enthusiasts is strictly functional. How a vehicle makes you feel when you go to drive it and punch the gas. I hate to break it to you, a lot of catback exhaust make near zero additional horsepower compared to the factory setup, but it sounds cooler, and that's part of the visceral feeling of driving a particular vehicle. So sometimes we do things that aren't necessarily inherently functional, but make us feel better when we drive the vehicle, the way it looks or the way it sounds. So I don't completely discount that as an added benefit. It's just a question of, is that something you consider a benefit? And that's something only you can answer. Now, I do have a few design considerations because I don't want to make things worse. So I'm going to also do some before and after testing. I have a taser that I use to correct my speedometer for the larger tires. One of its live features is that it will time 0 to 60 run. So I'll do a before and after so you can see if it made any difference in a 0 to 60 run. And I also do a gas mileage loop. I have about a 50-mile highway drive that I go out and do, and it helps me gauge whether or not something's made a difference in fuel economy. So if you've seen one of my previous videos, I did it with the stock tires, and then after I went to 35s, and you can see a rather large change that had on gas mileage. So we'll do that with this before and after, because like I said, we don't want to make things any worse. So two design considerations that I had when I was looking for an air intake. Number one, I wanted a plastic intake tube. Now you see some of these available on the market with a metal intake tube. My issue with those is metal tends to heat soak. So then the air passing through the intake tube is essentially passing through an oven before it goes into your engine. And that's really defeating the purpose of what we want to achieve. So there's a reason your factory air box is made of plastic. And it's not just that it's cheaper to manufacture, but it doesn't heat soak as bad either. So for me, when I was looking at some available intakes, I specifically wanted one with a plastic intake tube. The other design consideration, and I touched on it before, I like the style of this air box. So I'll show it to you on the vehicle once I get the old air box out, but there's a ambient air duct that runs from the grill underneath the factory air box. Now, the way the factory air box is designed, it doesn't take advantage of that cooler ambient air coming in from the grill area. The way this air box is shaped, that ambient air duct comes out like right here and is pointed upward. This is designed to kind of seal off the area and for that air to flow up so it can be sucked into the intake. If this has any chance at improving power performance or fuel economy by drawing in cooler air, in my opinion, it's going to come from this design feature. Now, you also have to consider, how do you plan to use your vehicle? One of the other things that gets talked about is for off-roading purposes, right? It is a Jeep, and Jeep wanted to be able to advertise it can go through a certain depth of water without sucking water into your intake. Obviously, that's a very bad thing. So if you're talking in terms of like, hey, I go off-road every weekend, I do a lot of deep mudding and a lot of deep water crossings, then looking at the design of the air intake, it may not even be worth changing the air box. Now, you'll notice this one, we'll compare it to the factory air box when I get it out, but this only changes the air intake height by a few inches. But some of them are a much more open filter setup, which could allow additional water in if you're going through a deep water crossing, you're going through a creek or river or something of that nature. So you've got to consider, how do you plan to use your vehicle? Not every modification is necessarily good for every single purpose and every single person. So I can't tell you how you're going to use your Jeep or whether or not you should spend money on it, but I'll illustrate for you what this air box does. In this case, I'm looking at the one from Banks Engineering. They call it their Ram Air intake. There's nothing Ram Air about it, but it's their aftermarket intake. I'm not going to spend too much time on the actual installation. This is a pretty straightforward type of modification. You've got your intake tube. It comes with a grommet that you'll install here. Your intake air temperature sensor will fit here, so that will need to be transferred over from your factory intake tube. There are a couple of pins here that just push in from the inside. This helps locate the air box. There are some rubber grommets that fit into the body, and there are a couple of E-clips that hold these in place so they don't come out. The other thing I'll mention, if you're shopping for an aftermarket intake, you'll typically get two choices when it comes to air filters. You have the oiled style air filter, K&N, very popular. I've run those for a very long time. And then you'll also see what they call a dry filter. The main difference is that the dry filter does not use oil to help capture dust and those elements as it passes through the filter. The way these are designed, they have a few additional layers in the filter itself to get the additional filtering capability that the oil in the other filters for dust collection. According to Banks, the dry filter flows about 3% less versus the oiled filters. The only drawback, in my opinion, to the oiled filters is if you can't help yourself, and when you go to apply, you clean it and then you apply new oil, if you saturate the filter with too much oil, it can pull it through when your intake begins sucking air through. If you've saturated the filter with too much, that oil can be in the intake air and it can gum up mass airflow sensors or your throttle body or the intake air temperature sensor. Now, I've never had an issue with it, and I've run oil style filters on half a dozen vehicles for the last 17 years. But that can be an issue for some folks if they go nuts with that little can of red oil. So something to think about. In this case, I went with the dry filter because that's what they had in stock and was available, and I don't think the difference of 3% in airflow on a filter this size on a 3.6 liter Jeep engine is going to make any difference to begin with. So with all of that said, we'll start with, I'm going to go out and do the gas mileage in 0 to 60 loops. For practical purposes, I'm going to go do the gas mileage loop first, and then I'll do the 0 to 60 run. That way the engine bay and engine are up to temperature, whatever it's going to be. That 50-mile loop will get everything heated up. That way we have a more consistent before and after. We don't get differing results just because the engine was cooler in one application versus the other. So with all of that said, let's dive into it and let's stay tuned for some results. All right, removing the factory airbox is fairly straightforward. Probably the most difficult thing is removing the intake air temperature sensor. When it's installed, it's twisted like that, and you see that little ledge right there is what keeps that tab where my thumb's at from twisting. So if you bend the sensor back just a little bit, I actually used a little small flathead just to kind of pry it up and get it over that lip, and then twist the sensor. If you need to, you can use some needle nose pliers just to give you a little bit of leverage to twist that sensor, and it only rotates I don't know, maybe a quarter of a turn, and what you're doing is aligning those little tabs in there. I don't know how well you can see that, but then this just slides out, and then there are a couple of clips here. You can cut them or use it, again, a little flathead screwdriver to loosen the tab and pop those out. And then you've got a couple of bolts to undo. I don't know if I can do that one-handed, but press in that tab and then pull on that hose, and that will come loose. And then we've got a bolt over here as well. Okay, so I've got the factory air box removed, and I wanted to show you, so this is the ambient air duct. So if you can look, it goes back up here towards the grill, and if you can see through the opening there, that hole in the grill is what feeds that air duct as it comes through. And then it's giving you at least a small source of fresh air from outside of the engine bay, which is obviously hotter. So we discussed earlier the difference in water depth or water fording capabilities. So the way the factory airbox is designed, it almost kind of snorkels upward. So that's where air comes into the airbox. Now compare this to the Banks air box. Obviously it has a much larger opening here for more air to come through, but you've changed the height at which, I guess if your engine bay were filling with water, there's a, I don't know, 4, maybe 6 inch difference between water at this level and water at that level. Now, for the way I use my Jeep, I never plan to have it into water up to here, but if you do a lot of mudding or a lot of deep water crossing, then that is something to consider. Obviously, there is a difference in the level at which water could get into the airbox. So that's just kind of a side-by-side comparison to give you an idea of what is changing. And obviously, as we talked about, the ambient air duct is going to come out through here, and it's kind of pointed upward. So it's going to allow this airbox to make better use of that versus the factory airbox with the air ducts coming out through here, but it's basically just blowing on the bottom of the airbox because it would have to come up and around and come back down, and it's probably not the most efficient. So I'm going to move on with the rest of the installation. Okay, there we go. So that's the Banks air intake installed. Really, this takes 15-20 minutes maybe. Make sure you reinstall your intake air temperature sensor. Make sure you align it so that the air is flowing through the sensor. Make sure you reconnect your vacuum lines. Make sure your clamps are snug. Give things a little tug, just make sure nothing's loose. Alright, just filled up at the gas station, getting ready to head out. So set the trip odometer to 0 miles. So we're going to head out. I'll also have a scan tool, and I'm watching the live data. So particularly one of the things I'm going to look at when I'm on the highway is what is my air intake temperature as a live feed while I'm driving. I'm going to jump out on the highway. It's about a 50-mile loop. Highway speeds, typically I'm going to set the cruise at 75 and let the cruise control do the rest for me, and we'll see how we do. So stay tuned. We've been on the highway for 11, 12 miles, something like that. I may have said earlier that the temperature was 69 degrees. It's actually 72 degrees. And I've been watching the air intake temperatures on this scan tool. If I can show that to you without wrecking. It's been reading about 77 degrees. So we're roughly 5 degrees over the ambient temperature. So I'll keep an eye on that through the course of the drive and just see if that goes up or down. And we'll compare that once we get the other intake on. Okay, so I just finished the gas mileage loop. This is with the factory air box. So we drove 51.3 miles and we used 3.133 gallons. So that gives us a fuel economy 16.3. As far as the intake air temperature on the scan tool, for most of the trip, when I first left the gas station, it was reading about 79 degrees. Out on the highway for a while, it got down to 77. And then on the return trip, because this is just a interstate driving, I get down to a certain exit and I turn around and come back. For most of the return trip, it was reading about 79 degrees and even got up to 81 degrees when I had to slow down for just a second in a bit of traffic. In the ambient air temp, 72, it got up to 73 or 74 at different points on the trip. So on average, I'd say we're probably 5 to 7 degrees above the ambient air temp as far as intake air temperature going through the air box into the motor. And that's on the highway. Excuse me. The moment you slow down, even just a little bit, intake air temperatures go up almost immediately. So there is air being pushed in through the grill and through that ambient air duct, and you see that impact on intake air temperatures the moment you begin to slow down. But those readings we're taking on the interstate at 75 miles per hour. We'll move on now. I'm going to go do the 0 to 60 run. All right, so stock airbox, do a 0 to 60 run. Get the RPMs up a bit. There we go. That registered 8.8. It's a little slower than I've seen in the past, but it's a bit warmer today, and I have the air conditioning on as well. But that should at least be a baseline that we can compare with for the aftermarket airbox, just to see if it makes any difference. All right, we'll do a 0 to 60 run. This is with the Banks intake, and give you a chance to hear the sound as well. There you go. I believe the 0 to 60 time before was 8.88, and that was 8.80. So very similar. Temperature outside very similar. To a tenth of a second one way or the other. I'm not sure that's a marked improvement. It could go either way. Hopefully you could hear, hopefully the microphone could pick up the sound of the intake. It is significantly louder. Okay, it's day 2. I am not content with the last fuel economy reading that I got. Just seemed like it was off, maybe not completely accurate. So I'm going to do it one more time. It's the second day. So we're just topped off the fuel tank and reset that. Now you can see it's warmer outside today. It's at least 82 degrees, and I've got the scan tool going again. So I'm going to monitor the intake air temperature again and see how that compares. And we'll try one more time with the fuel economy, see if we can get a more accurate reading. Okay, so just a quick update. I've been out on the highway a little while, and I think temperatures are probably stabilized. The outside temperature is running about 83 degrees, maybe 82 degrees. It kind of fluctuates just a bit. The intake air temperature has been very steady at 91 degrees. So we're between 8 and 9 degrees over maybe the ambient temperature, which is fairly consistent with what I saw yesterday. Even though the temperatures were a little cooler yesterday, intake air temps relative to ambient air temp was running about 9 degrees over ambient. So okay, so I just finished the loop with the on day 2, the gas mileage loop. So this time I just filled up. Hopefully you can see this, but I used 3.217 gallons, which is much more in line. Yesterday with the stock airbox, I think I used 3.1 gallons. I'll have to go back and look at the receipt, but very, very similar. One difference today is about 10 degrees warmer. Ambient air temperature, it was like 72 yesterday. Today is right around 82 degrees. Exact same route every single time. It's all interstate driving. I get off on the same exit. So really no variations in the distance driven. Using an extra tenth of a gallon, it would make it like 15.9, right at 16 miles per gallon. And I will also mention there's more of a headwind today. It's been kind of strong gusty winds. So some very slight variances, more wind, a little bit warmer, so that it used a tenth of a gallon more. I guess it's not too surprising. So I think it kind of sums up what we suspected at the start of the video, both in terms of the 0 to 60 time and the gas mileage. Really, essentially no difference. I don't see any difference in the 0 to 60 time, because I mean it shaved off 0.08 seconds 0 to 60, and the same thing with the gas mileage, with the amount of gas used on the exact same trip, within a tenth of a gallon. Today's a little warmer, a little windier, so to me kind of says probably about the same from fuel economy as well. Okay, so I wanted to film a follow-up on the Banks intake. I've actually had it on my Jeep probably 4 or 5 months now, a little while since I did the initial installation, and I thought I'd just do a recap summary of my impressions of it, because I've been driving with it for a while now, both around town. Took a road trip with my wife. I actually towed the race car in my enclosed trailer up to VIR a couple of months ago. So I've used it in a variety of scenarios, so I feel like I can give you a pretty good idea. At idle, you don't really notice it, right? It's just open air intake. Mid-throttle, like getting on the highway, where you've kind of got your foot in it, but not like wide open throttle. That's really its sweet spot. It's got a nice throaty sound. You can hear it, but it's not overwhelming. Makes you feel like you're driving something kind of special. Wide open throttle at high RPM. So if you're on the highway doing 70 and you floor it to go around somebody, in my opinion, that's when it's too loud. It's so loud, it's going to interrupt the conversation with the passenger. It is the dominant sound. You'd hear it over the radio. I took a coworker with me one day. We were driving somewhere, and I was showing him the intake, and you floor it out on the highway, and the conversation stops. That is just the dominant sound. So in my opinion, for just a regular Jeep 3.6 liter, I don't want my intake that loud. I mean, if it's a supercharger in a sports car and you hear that, like, okay, that's something special. That intake, in my opinion, I just don't want it quite that loud. No, now for comparison, my best friend also has a Gladiator. He's got the 6-speed manual transmission, and he got the Red Rock open air intake, which is a much more basic, it's just the open filter element and a little, well, I guess it's probably a little longer, just metal tube. His is not nearly as loud. I got a chance to drive that. Went up to see him in New Jersey a few months ago. You hear it, it's kind of throaty, but not nearly as loud. In sort of all scenarios, it's just not quite as loud. So the Banks intake in particular is louder than maybe some other open air intakes on the market. So just as a point of comparison. Also, from driving it for the past few months, I can tell you I have not seen any appreciable difference in gas mileage, neither an increase nor decrease. It's essentially no change. And my perception of power as well, I'm gonna seat of pants, I didn't put it on the dyno, but nothing you saw the video 0 to 60 runs and that sort of thing. I don't see anything to suggest that there was a power increase. If there was anything in the mid-range or whatever, it's not enough that you can feel it from the driver's seat. I mean, there's the sound, and if you're mid-throttle, getting on the highway, it sounds good and that sort of thing. But I wouldn't say it's any faster. And in towing the trailer, so I had an 8.5 by 16 enclosed race car trailer, and if you've seen some other videos, I had the single seat race car. That setup was probably about 4,500 pounds, and of course, it's an enclosed trailer. It's always under load when you're towing, and it's that part throttle. When you start to lug the engine, in my opinion, it gives sort of a droning sound. It hasn't downshifted yet to get the RPMs up, but there's a load, so the throttle blade starts to open. And in my opinion, you really hear the intake then, but it's more of a droning scenario. Now, it's not the end of the world. I don't tow with it that often, but I'd say in that scenario, I didn't quite love it. It just wasn't my favorite. I could have done without it, particularly with that mine with the 35s on it. It's already pushing a load to begin with, so it's prone to downshifting to stay in the power band. I probably just heard the intake a bit more than maybe I would have preferred, but not so much that it was like a deal breaker. Also took a road trip with my wife to the mountains. Now, just for a point of reference, if you've seen my other video where I checked, did my gas mileage loop before the intake. On this trip from where I'm at to the North Carolina mountains, it was a couple of 100 miles, mostly highway. That was actually the Memorial Day weekend earlier this summer. Surprisingly, I averaged out about 17.5 miles per gallon, which is the highest I've ever seen for extended highway driving. A little bit higher than what I was seeing on my gas mileage loop, which is only about 50 miles here in the interstate, around town. So is any of that attributable to the new intake? It's hard to say. I think it's more of just sustained long periods of highway driving, bringing up the true average of highway fuel economy. Also driving around the mountains, typically low speeds, 35, 45 miles per hour, but you're always going up inclines, so the engine's always under a load. You certainly hear the intake a lot more in those scenarios, and that was a road trip with my wife. Now, she's not one to complain about that sort of thing, but again, maybe a little bit more intake noise than I would prefer for that type of vehicle. Again, if it were a sports car and you were hearing a supercharger or something, that would be more acceptable in my opinion, but in a Jeep, just not quite maybe what I would prefer. So now that said, we're 4 or 5 months later, and I still have the intake on the Jeep. So I don't hate it. I don't love it. I'm sort of in a neutral ground. It's already on the vehicle and I haven't been motivated. I saved my old stock intake, and I don't know, at the moment I haven't been motivated enough to swap back to the stock intake. There are some scenarios, and I'm typically not wide open throttle high RPM very often in my normal driving to begin with, so that the scenario where it's just too loud, I really don't encounter that very often. So the other scenarios are sometimes really good, and then sometimes where it's just maybe mildly annoying. So knowing what I know now, that there's no real change in gas mileage and no real increase in horsepower, performance, that sort of thing, would I buy it again? My money, I probably wouldn't. There's nothing wrong with the intake, certainly a high quality piece. It was certainly very easy to install. Just for my taste, I think it's maybe just a little too loud of an intake. So maybe I wouldn't do it again. But that said, I also didn't go with mud tires because I didn't want it super loud, and I don't have an exhaust on it because I didn't want it too loud. So use that as a gauge for maybe what my preferences are for how loud I want my vehicle. I still want to be able to talk on the Bluetooth and that sort of thing. So I hope that helps. I hope that gives you some perspective if you're looking at a Banks open air intake, or I think the power and fuel economy would be pretty much the same across any brand of intake, that I don't think there'd be much gains to be had in that scenario, regardless of what brand you went with. And like I said, maybe some other brands would be a little bit quieter. So if you're interested in that perspective, I can't, my buddy's Red Rock intake, I didn't do any testing with it to see, I'm sure he didn't gain any horsepower, but it did hurt his fuel economy because intake temps are higher or something. Again, probably, I don't think there's enough of a change there to make much of a difference. You're really just getting the sound. But if that's something you really enjoy, maybe consider some other brands of intake, or if you really want a loud intake, you're like that sort of thing, then the Banks is a really nice unit. So I hope that helps. I don't know if that was a surprise ending for you or not. Typically, I like most of the modifications I do. This one, maybe not my favorite. I don't hate it, but maybe I wouldn't do it again. So on that bombshell, as they say on Top Gear, I'll leave you. If you have any questions at all, hit me up in the comments. I'll answer anything that I can for you. As always, if you enjoy this type of content, hit the like button. And if you want to stay up to date with whatever I'm doing here in the garage, whether it's my Jeep or a race car or anything else that I might bring into the garage, hit the subscribe button. That certainly helps me in the channel. I do this just for fun on the side. I certainly have a day job, but knowing that people enjoy the content by hitting the like button means a lot to me. So with that said, I look forward to seeing you next time here on Scruff's Garage.